and welcome to another episode of the Veterans History Project. Along with me is my co-host today, as always, is Dr. Lee Hutchinson of the United States Army Air Corps from World War II, a B-17 crew member. Thanks again for being here, Lee.
I have to correct you, I'm not a doctor. I'm an educational specialist.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a
I can put on
PhD,
Band-Aids,
is it?
but I can't cure you.
Yeah, okay. You got a PhD, right?
I got something like that.
Yeah, there we go. We got another PhD with us here today.
Yeah.
Dr. Sam Martin, he's a United States Air Force veteran, A-10 pilot from the Gulf War. Also along with us, former Bedford Fire Chief, John Hughes, a U.S. Navy veteran. John, welcome. Sam, welcome. Really appreciate you guys coming in and being with us today to talk about what you did in the U.S. military. Sam, I guess we'll start out with you. What type of aircraft did you fly? I know you were a pilot in the Air Force. Got to be several of them.
Yes, I was a pilot. I flew, besides training aircraft, I flew about 5 different aircraft for the Air Force. I flew started out in pilot training. I flew the T-37, T-38. And then I went from the pilot training went to Panama, and I flew the O2. I don't know if you guys know what that is. It's a little Cessna 337. I was a forward air controller there. And also was a ground forward air controller also. I don't know if you know what that is, ground back. But I had to go out with the Army in a jungle in Panama and control airstrikes from the ground. Did that with the Ranger Battalion and Special Forces down there. And after that, I flew with the Michigan Air National Guard, and I flew the A-37 Dragonfly. Both these aircraft are Vietnam era aircraft. Okay, so that was a small attack jet. You know, I flew up at Battle Creek for 2.5 years or so. And then after that, I got back into active duty Air Force and flew the A-10. And from there, I went from Davis-Monthan, where I was trained to fly the A-10. I went to RAF Alconbury in England. I spent another 2.5 years there. And while I was there, I went to the Gulf War in the A-10. And then I was out of the Air Force for probably 6-7 years, got back in, flew the A-10 again. And after that, I flew the F-117 stealth fighter. And after that, I did a little time in trainers. But that pretty much sums up my flying career.
Did you ever work as a test pilot or anything like that?
Well, at Davis-Monthan, I was the chief functional check flight pilot. So I had to test A-10s after they had major maintenance done. And I would say 50% of the time they probably worked fine.
50% of the time.
Probably, at least.
But you had to shake them down. You had to go out there.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times they didn't fly the way they were supposed to, but you know, that's why they pay the big bucks, right? So.
That's right. Were you ever a training instructor? Or?
Well, my last assignment was at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas. And I was in training to be an instructor pilot in a T-37. And I had some problems with my hearing, and turned out I had a middle ear disease that had to be taken care of. And I had it corrected, my hearing corrected, but that was the end of my flying right there. You know, so I ended up, you know, finishing of the 20 years there at Shepherd, and retired there. And then I worked for contractors for years after that.
I know in Afghanistan, I was a civilian in Afghanistan, and the troops on the ground would cheer every time they saw an A-10 come over. They were really glad to see those A-10s come.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah.
Now you have to describe the A-10 for us. Describe
the A-10?
Was it a jet?
Yeah, it's a twin-engine attack jet. You know, when I first started flying it, you know, it's slower aircraft. I mean, when I flew the A-37 at Battle Creek, it was actually a faster jet, even though it couldn't carry as many bombs or many bullets or anything. But the A-10, you know, we're talking maybe 300 knots down low, 350, maybe max, you know, which that's fast for a car, you know, but for a fighter or attack jet, it's not that fast. But it's made that way so you can maneuver at low altitude and stay in the target area. You know, so I learned how to fly that in Tucson, Arizona, and I thought, well, you know, it's a slow aircraft, but it was fun to fly. You know, it was a lot of fun. But then I never really ever thought I was going to be in a war with the A-10, because I was stationed at RF Alconbury, and we were there for World War III, basically. We were there to defend the upper third of Germany, and You know, that was during the end of the what do you call it, the
Cold War?
Cold War. Yeah, into the Cold War. And, you know, we had to do buffer zone training and everything. And you know, we weren't going to fly in combat unless the end of the world was upon us, you know. So I never thought we'd be in combat. So we trained to fly at treetop level, a little bit higher, you know, under the clouds. And it was dangerous type of flying, even in peacetime. But so that's how we were trained, just to shoot Maverick missiles. I don't know if you know what a Maverick missile is. It's a 500-pound rocket that you shoot at tanks. Had shape charge in it, and it could destroy a tank. We had the 30-millimeter gun. So we only dropped bombs for familiarization training. We never expected to drop bombs in war, just shoot the missiles and shoot the gun for standoff. You know, you would shoot them as far out as you could and then duck down behind a hill or something. And that's how you defend against getting shot down. But toward the end of my time at RAF Falconberry, they decided, you know, the invasion of Iraq or Kuwait happened by Iraq, and there were 6 squadrons of A-10s in England at that time, and 4 of them was at RAF Bentwaters, and we had 2 at RAF Falconberry. And little background information, every year in United States Air Force Europe and USAFE, they give a top fighter squadron in USAFE. Well, my squadron won that in 1990. So they decided it needed an extra A-10 squadron to go to Saudi Arabia. Well, guess who got chosen?
The best.
Yeah, right. So we ended up going to Saudi Arabia. I got there on Christmas Day in 1990, and as soon as I didn't fly a jet down, but and when I landed I flew a C-5, I think. I flew in the back of C-5. And we landed at King Fahd International Airport. And as soon as we got off the airplane and the auxiliary power units shut down and everything, I could hear Bob Hope entertaining the troops to the 101st Airborne was there. And you could hear on loudspeakers, you could hear Bob Hope. It was on Christmas Day. That's my first day in Saudi Arabia, which was interesting. But anyway, so less than a month later, we're in combat, but we had to fly and fight in ways we never trained to before. We were trained to fly low, very low, and like I was explaining before, but we ended up in the Gulf War flying at medium altitude, 10, 15, 20,000 feet, and doing dive bombs. So all we had was familiarization training with bomb dropping, but we ended up doing it, you know, quite a lot, you know. So we had maybe a couple weeks training in the war, and that was the first place that I ever shot a Maverick missile, a live one, was in the war, you know. So yeah, it was interesting. So about 6 weeks of intense combat, and it was over. So.
Well, I want to talk to John Hughes here for a minute. John, you were in the Navy, correct?
Yes, I was.
And what type of ships were you on?
I was stationed on the USS Forrestal. She was a aircraft carrier, the first super carrier, meaning that in 1954, when they started building her, she was the first angle deck, meaning where we could recover our jets and launch off of the front of the ship all at the same time.
And you called her. Would you
Yes.
explain that for the audience, why that
All
is?
Navy ships that's above the water are females, no matter if they're named after a male, after a president. The Forrestal was the first Secretary of Defense in 1940 to 1942. So all carriers, all ships above water are females, and then below water, a submarine is a boat.
It's going to be the only thing you're going to be hearing called a boat.
In the Navy,
In the Navy,
are ships, and a sub is a boat.
Maybe some ferry boats that take the people back and forth
That-
from
yes.
shore to the ship. So what did you do in the Navy?
I was a aviation fuels, ABF. I went to boot camp at Great Lakes in 1987, graduated and went straight to Lakehurst, New Jersey for what they call my A school, my ABF school. Now, what's famous about Lakehurst is that's where they housed the Hindenburg when it was here. And my schooling was in the actual hangar bay where they housed the Hindenburg. So after I graduated A school, I had my orders to go to the forestall. She was probably about the middle of the Atlantic, so we flew out. They flew us out to the ship, and we called her there. We was at sea about 2 months before we got back to Jacksonville, Florida. Mayport was our home port.
And just like in the Army, where everybody has a secondary as a soldier, no matter what your particular job title is, in the Navy, wasn't just about everybody's secondary as a fireman?
Yes, the forestall was known as a fire a day at sea, and we pretty well had a fire every day at sea. Minor fires, but a fire at sea, you're either putting it out or you're swimming home.
So that kind of worked right around to your civilian job too, when you came back.
Sure. Something else famous about the forestall was back in the 60s in the Bay of Detonk at Senator McCain. John McCain was on board the forestall as a fighter pilot, and they had a bomb go off, and it caused kind of like a chain reaction. The bomb hit a plane, that plane blew up another one on down the line, and you can see Senator McCain jumping, getting out of the cockpit, going to the nose of his fighter jet, jumping and rolling through the flames to get to safety. The forestall burnt for 3 days. Now, when you're dealing with metal, especially with bombs, it causes a magnesium fire. So the fire burnt through the flight deck, the deck below, the deck below, the deck below. We had other ships coming up with their water canyons putting out the fire. And also, when it was all said and done, it was like 173 sailors lost their life them 3 days.
Did you see the damage that was left over from that when you were on board the Forrestal?
No, they brought her home, and she was totally redone. I mean, now the only thing we had was a plaque on one of the hangar bay doors, hangar bay 1, just remembering everything about that fire.
How big of a plane could land on that? You said they flew you out to the forest.
Right.
How big of a plane?
Well, all stuff like that is top secret. They would put out, she will hold at least 93. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't, it's all top secret stuff, right at 93. Mm. Now that's fighter jets, our CODs, our mail planes, anything like that.
Did you have any rotor aircraft on board the Forrestal?
No. Yes, we did. We had the Warhogs. It's kind of like the radar planes.
Now, Sam, did you fly any commercial jetliners after you got out of the Air Force?
No, I have an airline transport pilot license, but no, I have never flown an airliner.
I'm just seeing if there was a civilian conversion there, but you're also qualified to teach college courses. Is that correct?
Yeah, I taught for the Air Force from 2016 to last year, 2023. But I was a professor in their Air Command and Staff College. They had a master's program for the military art and science degree, and I taught a couple of classes in that. So did that online. Did that for several years. Had about 1,000 students in those years.
Are you doing any teaching right now?
No, my wife made me give that up. So.
Mr. Yancey, he's the superintendent for North Lawrence Community Schools. Mr. Yancey's always looking for teachers. So if you're watching this, Mr. Yancey, his wife says no. But anyway, that's very impressive. And you got your PhD while you were in the Air Force.
Well, partly. I started it while I was in the Air Force, and then finished it when I was a contractor at Altus Air Force Base. So.
And what college did you teach through? Any?
Well, major... it was there at Maxwell Air Force Base. It was just the Air
Community
University.
College of the Air Force.
Air University. Yeah. So did that for several years. It was fun, but it was one of those things where it wasn't it's called asynchronous. You would get on there and put messages out to and announcements out to the students, and then we'd have discussion groups and things, but we weren't together live, ever. So it's a little bit different, but I had a lot of students. So,
Well, John, you had to learn training too. How many firefighters, when you were training there at the department?
Well, in my 32 and a half years on the department, there's 37 firefighters. When I was fire chief, I hired 13 firefighters. So, I wasn't involved in the everyday training of them, but I participated a bunch. And then as I was making my way up the ranks, I would participate in training the new firefighters.
Were you ever the training officer for the department?
No, I was not.
You got lucky there, huh?
Yes.
Sam, did you have to train any new pilots on how to operate the particular jet? Never had to do
nope,
that.
I trained people on the ground when I was a ground fac. I trained people how to do that. But as far as flying, no, I was in training to be an instructor pilot at the end there, and I had to give that up. But so, nope, never did it.
Well, one of the things that's made the A-10 so successful is the separation of the engines on the rear of the aircraft.
Yes.
Were you cognizant of that when you're flying into harm's way?
Well, it was made, I was surprised it was as survivable as it was, but I remember during the war taxiing out to go fly, and sometimes you would see planes with several hundred holes in them, from previous mission. So that was kind of disconcerting. But yeah, some people came back with, part of their wing shot off, and you could lose half a wing, an engine, and half of your tail and still fly.
Yeah, what we're talking about is the separation of the engines on the A-10, say, versus the F-15. You got two engines side by side in an F-15. One strike can take out both of those engines, where the A-10, it's got to be a pretty significant strike to take out both those engines because of the separation.
Yeah. Yeah, so it had redundancies, and, it was controls were hydraulic, but you could flip a switch and change it over to manual just by cables. Feels like you're driving around a dump truck, without power steering. But it takes a lot of force to move it. But people have brought them back and actually landed them with what's called manual reversion. So I had to test that out when I tested airplane with the A-10s also. And sometimes it doesn't really go in to engage like it should. So it's always a surprise. But
do you have ram air turbines on the A-10s like you do civilian?
No, it had an auxiliary power unit.
Okay, APU, sure.
Yeah, so you usually flew with it off, but if you lost both engines, you turn it on first thing, and then you have to use that to start your engines. So.
John, what type of aircraft did you work on in the Navy?
I myself, I did
around.
Right. We had the F-14s. At the end of my career, we had the F-18s. We had some, of course, the Warhogs, the E6. We had some cod planes, some mail cod. We called them mail cods because they brought us our mail, and then they were our transports. They actually flew me back when I was injured in a mail plane.
Oh, carrier-borne cargo planes,
Yes,
then, basically.
Yes.
You see that on some videos depicting Navy aircraft
Yes.
landing on the carriage. You'll notice that they come in, they're unarmed, don't even have flare pods on them most times.
That's true. Yes.
Couldn't even mark a target if they wanted to.
Yeah.
Now, the F-117, you said you flew the stealth fighter as well.
Yes, I did.
Were those supersonic or those subsonic?
No, they're
aircraft?
subsonic.
Subsonic?
Yeah, yeah. I flew that after my second assignment at Davis-Monthan, and I volunteered to be accepted to the F-117, and ended up getting accepted in that program. And there's only like maybe 40 of them ever built, and when you first flight of F-117, they give you what's called a bandit number. I'm bandit 581, and there's been less than 600 people ever fly that airplane. You know, so there's very few of those that have flown, and it's a very small community, obviously. But when I first flew it in, I think it was February of 2000, you know, so it was about a year after Allied Force. They flew in combat in Allied Force, and then I ended up joining F-117 community after that. But I spent 3 years there at Holloman in New Mexico. But yeah, it was completely different than the A-10. You know, it flew a lot faster and higher. It was all automated. So the least used thing in a cockpit was a stick. You know? So
I don't want to go into too much detail or get you to go into too much detail,
Yeah.
but it's pretty much publicly known that that's the type of aircraft that wiped out Saddam's inner circle, so to speak, and just luckily he wasn't in the bunker that night. What we're talking about is a specialized device that was manufactured to penetrate an air shaft in Saddam's command and control bunker during was it the first Gulf War that happened?
well, they use them in both, in Iraqi freedom and the Gulf War. So yeah,
The Iraqis couldn't even see these aircraft coming. They're so stealthily camouflaged with
well, yeah,
special.
there's a lot to it.
Yeah,
you know,
can't go too much into it. I don't expect you to.
yeah, but you know, it was more mysterious. You know, there's more mystique about it, I guess, than the A-10. The A-10 was fun. You know, it was exciting flight. Every mission was different. You never knew what was going to happen, you know, on a combat mission. But the stealth, you planned it a day ahead. Everything, every knot of airspeed, altitude, turns, headings, everything, it's all pre-planned on a computer. And you do that a day before, all the targets. So when you take off, you basically point it in the right direction, put the gear up, autopilot, and monitor it. And when it's your time to drop the bombs, then you use what you have to guide the laser and drop the bombs. But it has a bomb bay, and you have one bomb in each bomb bay, and you could drop 2 bombs at one time. We call it dual door deliveries. And you can actually it's like a barn door almost. They go to the center, and it would get out of the way. Bomb would drop, and it would go back up. But when you dropped it, you could feel the airplane kind of fishtail a little bit in the wind when those big doors but when that happened, you were not stealth anymore, because you could see it was the metal and everything in there. So it was quick, boom, bomb drop, pop, goes back up. It was within a couple seconds, you know, just real quick, you know. So if you did a dual door delivery, you could put the 2 bombs in the same hole with it, and that made a big, you know, you could penetrate a target much more with a dual door delivery. Or you could drop 1 bomb, go to the next target, drop another one, but that's it. Either 1 target, 2 bombs, or 2 targets with 2 bombs. But that's it. So you would take off normally, and you know, at night, obviously, and you would hold at a certain, well, you may go to a tanker, which is usually what you did. You went to a tanker, filled up, make sure you had topped off with gas, and then go to a hold point. And then when it's your time, it's all scientific. It's all based on time, because a 0 second time on target. In other words, if you're supposed to drop a bomb and that bomb's supposed to hit at 9 o'clock, or let's say midnight, that bomb's hitting at midnight, exactly at midnight, you know. So if you were off in training, if you're off 1 second, that was bad, you know. But they'd have a lot of times where they have the stealth would be like a flight of 4. They would go different directions, different altitudes, attacking the same target area with bombs dropping. And you could do that on a computer to deconflict all the bombs and everything, and you would crisscross, and the bombs would go off nearly the same time, you know. So it's pretty complicated, you know. It's all orchestrated, but you have to be exactly at the right spot at the right time, or it doesn't work. So, but it was interesting. It was something very different. A lot of night flying, obviously, but yeah.
It was basically a bomber.
A light bomber. But you know, you could drop a couple of 2,000-pound bombs in one spot, and you saw them on TV what they did.
How many usually went on the target?
How many what?
How many planes flew?
Well, like I said, we only had 40 airplanes,
see.
in existence. So, I mean, it's hard to say. But you could do a flight of 4 or a flight of 2 aircraft and to hit a target. But
That's all you
I would
needed.
say, probably 10 to 12 airplanes. I would guess, would take off and each go and fly their mission and then do it again. I guess after you refuel and rearm. But you can do it all night, but you need to fly at night. You don't need to be doing that in the day.
Kind of does away with your stealth, doesn't it? If they can
It could,
spot
yeah.
you.
It could, yeah, definitely, yeah. So you don't want anybody to see you. But yeah, but it was easier to fly in the night. It was hard to fly sometimes in broad daylight. We did it in training, flew in daytime. But you're always taking something and trying to block the sun so you could see all your sensors and everything, So you had to really sometimes put your head in front of that was the only aircraft I flew that you couldn't see any of your aircraft, the outside of your aircraft in the cockpit. You could if you pressed your head really hard against the side and the window went like this. It went out. So you had a little roof over your head, about like right here, and it would go out. So if you put your head against, you could see the tip of the wing way back there if you really tried. But just sitting there, you're just like flying in a cockpit. You can't see any of the outside of your aircraft. And you can't see behind you very good. So if you're flying formation, if you rejoin on your flight lead and you're a little too fast and you pass him up and you have to take the lead because you can't see him anymore. So
Where were you based when this all when you were
at Holloman Air Force Base, Alamogordo, New Mexico.
in Mexico?
Yeah.
You were flying to Arabia, Iran?
No, that's where I was stationed at.
Where were you stationed when you were in combat?
No, in combat, I flew the A-10 in combat. I didn't fly the stealth in combat, but in the A-10, I was at King Fahd International Airport. So it's
Saudi
not
Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. Yeah, Saudi Arabia. But I ended up going to Kuwait for a year at the embassy there during Iraqi freedom. But got to see all the places I bombed in Kuwait. So.
Well, they never tell us any of that. It's all top secret. They
Yeah.
can't talk about this. They can't
Yeah.
talk about that. We just get the report of
Right.
the victories.
Yeah.
So it's a different type of situation.
Yeah. So, but one thing I was reminded of is when I was in Panama, they had an opportunity for some of us to go out and land on it, not land our own aircraft, but I went out to the Eisenhower, and I flew on a COD, C-1 COD, and it was supposed to be for one day. It was out in the Caribbean, and the weather was bad, and it got stuck there for 3 days. So it was called Air Force Appreciation for 3 days. But yeah, what was funny about that was it was an education for sure. But believe it or not, I saw 2 people from Bloomington on that boat. Ship, whatever. But yeah, one guy was reading the Herald Telephone newspaper, and I walked up behind him. And I talked to him, and he went to Bloomington South, I think, and another gentleman I was in ROTC with for a while at IU. But yeah, there's like 5,000 or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A carrier underway will have over 5,000 in my time men. Back in my Navy days, that women wasn't allowed on combat ships.
Yeah, that was the law at that time.
Yes, it was. Yes.
Yeah, especially under Ronald Reagan, World War II veteran. And then George Herbert Walker Bush followed him up, another World War II veteran. So yes, things were a little old-fashioned back then. Where all were you stationed at, John, when you were in the Navy?
Well, I just had one home port, and that was Jacksonville, Mayport, Florida. But I did go. I made 2 overseas deployments, and then one up in the North Atlantic on patrol up there.
What years were you in?
I was 87 to 91.
87 to 91. So that would have been just after we went after Gaddafi,
Yes,
and then just right at the start of the first Gulf War.
yes.
Did you get deployed to the Middle East?
Yes, I was We spent, well, both of my overseas deployments was in the Persian Gulf area. We never made it into the Persian Gulf. We stayed in the Indian Ocean. At the time, when we left the Suez Canal, which the Suez Canal separates the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, it takes for a carrier 24 hours to go through the Suez Canal. And it's so narrow that, honestly, if you jumped off of the top of the flight deck, you could swim to shore. I mean, it's that narrow. They had to close it all down for us to go through and then come back out. But when we left the Suez Canal, at that time, when we left, it was 109 straight days before we seen land. And at the time, that was a record for an aircraft carrier to be at sea without land. And then there's an old Navy tradition is if you're at sea for 40 straight days with no port calls, no land, you get what they call, for us, it was Still Beach Party. They flew on beer, Budweiser, and give us 2 cans of warm beer and hamburgers. But they would open the beer because they didn't want you taking it back down in the ship, into our berthing areas. So we had to drink 2 warm beers on top of the flight deck.
Did they bring sand on board?
No, that was a foreign object debris, so
All
no.
right. Did you ever become a shellback while you were out there?
Yes,
at sea?
I'm a shellback and a blue nose.
Okay, so what's a blue nose? Go ahead and let
Blue
everybody know.
nose is when you cross the international, and then a shellback, and this is what's neat, is shellback is when you become a shellback for a carrier, when we're going across, we will save, and this is really gross and nasty, but we'll save about 3 days worth of food, trash, and they take it up on the flight deck, and anybody that's not a shellback cross through it. That's Navy tradition.
It's a hazing.
Yes, and that's what we did. But
I'm
when
glad I
you're a
missed
blue
that.
nose, when you're a blue nose, the at the front of the ship there's a little porthole, and the youngest, least seniority officer on board the ship at that time hangs over and paints that little porthole blue. Another Navy tradition.
While the ship's underway.
Yes, sir. Yep.
That's kind of dangerous, it seems to
Well,
me.
you would think so, but
And they make an officer do it instead of an enlisted guy.
that's right. Yes.
Did you ever get to play Neptune during one of these shellback initiations?
No.
No? I've heard that's an honor reserved for a very few.
Yeah.
Who usually does that? Is it enlisted or is it an officer?
I think it's officers.
All right.
Yeah. But we did go, and Captain Thomasy, captain in '88, we was in about in the middle of the Atlantic. He gave us a swim call. We just went swimming.
In the middle of the Atlantic.
Yes, it was awesome.
Did you have anybody on Shark Watch?
Yeah, we have all carriers have a detachment of about 20 to 30 Marines. They protect our nuclear weapons, and of course the admiral and the captain. So they were on Shark Watch, and we got to go swimming.
In the middle of the Atlantic.
Yes.
There you go.
So you had 10,000 feet of water underneath you and you're out there swimming.
Very true. Yes.
That's amazing. I don't think I would want to have done it.
Yeah.
Did you ever go through any typhoons?
We, of course, when you're on the Atlantic
That's
side,
a hurricane.
it's hurricanes. We were on a port call in St. Thomas, the
Virgin
Bahamas,
Islands,
right?
sure.
And when Hurricane Hugo was going, we had an emergency pull away from St. Thomas, and the Pentagon told us to go on the other side of Puerto Rico to try to hide from it. And of course, that just simply tore Puerto Rico up. So they said, turn around tie everything down, and if you could fly it off, get it off the ship. So we brought all the planes, all the jets that was not flyable, put them down in the hangar bay, closed her up, tied everything down, and went through the eye of Hurricane Hugo. And this thing tossed us around for 2 days. And of course, we was at battle stations, general quarters for that whole duration, and it was.
What was it like in the eye? Did they let you come up and?
No, we stayed at general quarters, and actually the eye is the calmest part.
Correct.
Of a hurricane. But, you know, the forestall, we set 90 feet out of the water, and I could see on our closed circuit TV the waves coming up, clearing the flight deck to the other side. So it tossed us around. And that was about the only time that I could feel myself getting a little wheezy.
Oh, so you don't get seasick then?
No, I don't, but I was beginning to feel it a little bit.
Uh,
What kind of storms have you flown through, Sam?
Well,
You certainly have some
yes,
thunderstorms.
I've flown in near some storms, but you know, I flew. They asked me when I was in Panama if I wanted to go up to Davis Monthan. That's where they have the boneyard. You know, all the old planes.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so we call it the boneyard. But so we have another O2 up there we want to get. Would you mind going up there and flying it back? You know, I, being a dumb lieutenant, I said yes, you know, and I had to go up there and do the functional check flight on. It was a plane that had been sitting in the desert for a decade, maybe a couple decades, I don't know. But they brought it out of the boneyard, got it flying condition. I had to check it out and then fly it back to Panama. You know, so everything worked out great until I got to Mexico, and I had to fly from Veracruz, Mexico, to San Pedro Sula, Honduras, and I had a guy in my right seat. He was Bolivian crew. He was a crew chief, but he was from Bolivia, you know. And I brought him because he could speak Spanish, you know, fluently. But he slept most of the time, so it didn't really matter. But yeah, we took off Veracruz and we're heading toward Honduras. And this plane, it was 120 knots. It's a slow airplane. It's this little Cessna, you know. But we're heading toward San Pedro Sula, and I could see a storm system kind of moving from the south to the north. And I thought, well, I can keep going, and I can just kind of cut through the side of it a little bit, and I'll be in the clouds for a few minutes, you know, but I'll pop through it. I didn't have enough gas to deviate, you know. So I got into that edge of the storm, and to make a long story short, you know, we didn't have any oxygen. We couldn't go above 10,000 feet, but it was getting us tossed around pretty good, and I was pushing all the way down on the yoke, and I was still, the altimeter still going like this, up. You know, I think I finally was able to turn it around and head back the other direction. By the time I popped out, it was like over 16,000 feet up, you know, and I don't think the guy in the right seat knew what happened, but I would thought, you know, we almost died right there. You didn't even know what happened, you know, but I just went back to Veracruz because I couldn't go around it. I had to go back and top off with gas, you know, so ended up topping off, and the neck flew again, and that storm had moved off, but there was a lot of clouds left, a lot of cumulus clouds, and ended up having to weave it. I had to get up to 14 or 15,000 feet just to get around to make it, but we made it to San Pedro Sula. And then the next day I had to head on into Panama, and that's one of the airplanes you can fly. You can have 3 or 4 hours of gas left and be critically low of fuel because you're flying over the ocean, and there's, you know, point of no return you can get to. And the next day we took off, and we were supposed to land on a little island of Colombia. It's called San Andres Island, and it's such a small island. It's almost like an aircraft carrier. On one end of the runway is the beach, and on the other end is the beach. It's the other beach, you know. So I had to find this, and had a VOR. So had a little, and had that frequency tuned in, but we're out over the ocean, had to cut across Nicaragua a little bit, and it was a communist country back then, and I thought I would save a few hours, but we're out over the ocean, no nav aids receivable, no land in sight, you're just aiming, Lindberghing it, as we called it, time, distance, and heading, and just praying that the signal, I could pick up the signal and point me to the island, But there was a storm there, and just missed it, and ended up finally getting the signal and landing there. But by the time I got to Panama, there was more storms there. So by the time I landed, I was so happy that I made it. I almost went kissing the ground. I was so happy. And I landed. The squadron commander said, "Hey, welcome back," and gave me a beer and said, "Pat me on the back. Thanks a lot." I said, "You should have gave me a medal for that." But yeah, so it's 24 hours of flying time from Tucson to Panama. I landed in, El Paso. I landed in San Antonio, and Brownsville, I think, and Veracruz, Mexico, San Pedro Sula, Honduras, and San Andreas, Colombia, but that was that kind of flying we did back then. We flew down to South America a lot too, and I landed in Esmeraldas, Ecuador, with 6 gallons of gas left. Just barely made it there, and ended up having to spend the night on the ramp there because they didn't have gas. It was just landed, big runway landed, and it was only people that was there was the weatherman, the air traffic controller, and the guy who was in charge of the airport, and a cook that they had for this little restaurant they had there. And I was the only one that spoke any Spanish at all. Well, I got to sleep under the wing of the airplane took the cushions out of it, slept on the ramp. But they had to bring a C-130 in for the gas from Panama so we go into Ecuador, But yeah, but that was kind of cowboy flying. We would fly off of dirt strips a lot of times, just sleep not too far from your aircraft. But totally different than flying the stealth, let me tell you. A lot different.
Of course. You fly above the weather in a stealth.
Lot different. But
John, what kind of ports of call did you have that were exciting?
Well, I was in Mardi Gras. We took the ship up the river to Mardi Gras. We actually had to lower the ship to go underneath the bridge. We was at Fleet Week in New York, overseas. Of course, if you're in the Atlantic, you go to Naples, Italy. At the time, that was the largest naval base in that region for us. I was in Portsmouth, England, Benidorm, Spain, Cairo, Egypt. I like to tell people when I was in Naples, I went to see Rome for 3 nights, 2 days, for $30 American. So that was pretty neat. In Spain, we rented mopeds, motorcycles, and this guy he that we rented them from, he said, "Hey, you give me your military ID. I got to have ID." And that's Sam will tell you, and you, Brad Lee, you never give your ID up. No, well, you can't rent. Okay, we'll just go on down. We were able to rent our mopeds, motorcycles, and spent the day riding around. We was in Paris and England, Portsmouth, England was pretty neat. And of course, St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands. So we made the ship made its rounds. We spent a week in New York for Fleet Week. And at the time of that, I had enough rank on me to where I didn't have to stand duty. But Christmas, Portsmouth, England, Christmas of '88, beautiful, beautiful town. Anytime, in all my time overseas, if you was a naval ship with nuclear weapons, these countries wouldn't let you go port side. But that time, for some reason, England, Portsmouth, England, let us go pier side. So we docked the ship on the pier at Christmas time, and it was beautiful. And I was standing watch, pier watch. It's about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And when you're overseas, the only people that can rent a car and actually drive is lieutenant commanders and above. And I was standing pier watch at the gate, and this car came up, and I knew who it was. It was the captain of the ship, and I give him a nice salute and everything, and we stood there and talked a little bit, and he said, "Okay, petty officer, I should probably get on board the ship." I said, yes, sir, but I do need to see your ID. And he says, he kind of looked at me funny, and I'm thinking, oh, crap. He said, well, you know what? That is my standing orders, so here it is. I backed off and gave him a salute and opened the gate. He said, have a good night, sir.
Maybe he was testing you.
Yeah. Yeah, yes. We, another time anytime, you're enlisted, and my first time on the carriers, you have what you call 90 days of mess cranking. They send you down to the galley for 90 days, as galley help. We was underway, and I was working the night crew about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was shining all the brass. And I was down on my hands and knees shining away, and all of a sudden I hear this, "We don't clean that, soldier or sailor. We don't shine that." I said, "Yeah, okay." And then I heard that, "Yeah, okay," again, and I kind of looked down, and I see some khaki shoes, khaki pants. I look up, and I jump up, and I said, "Yeah, okay," to the captain of the ship. And I said, "I'm sorry, sir." He says, "Oh, that's okay. That's okay." But very, very cool captain.
Yes, I have found that Navy officers and Air Force officers are far more laid back than Marine Corps and Army officers. Far more laid back.
Yes. We at the end of my career, I was what you called the below deck supervisor, and we dealt with the JP4. It was all the jet fuel that would come on board, and then we'd clean it and send it up to the ship. And when you're underway, we'd have to bring on fuel. The Forstall was a conventional carrier, so she was a DFM, a high-graded diesel fuel, and then we'd have to bring on jet fuel about every other night or every third night. And I would have to have my guys on the sounding tubes with kind of like a tape measure, measuring how much fuel we were putting on in these tanks. And one of the sounding tubes was down in the Marine berthing area. And these Marines, they give my guys all kinds of heck, "What are you doing?" Just harassed them. We'd been underway about 3 months, and I'd had enough of it. We'd bring in fuel on one night, and I had ordered 1.5 million gallons of fuel. And I had to bring it in and put it in that tank below the Marine berthing area. And I put about 60,000 gallons in that Marine berthing area on purpose. So they would get the idea to leave my guys alone. They called away the DC team, damage control, the fire brigade and everything. And we got it all under control. I closed it. And when stuff like that happens, whoever's in charge of that area, they had to clean the mess up, which I knew that. So that next day, my chief warrant officer called and said, "Hey, Hughes, what happened?" I said, "Chief, I bring it on 1.5 million. I had 5 tanks open at the same time. I lost one. I mean, I'm sorry." He said, "Well, the division officer wants to see you." So we went up there, and I told him the same thing. He said, "The air boss wants to see you." So I kept on going on up. I ended up on the bridge at the captain. He said, "Petty officer, what happened?" And I told him the same story. 1.5, sir, I lost 1 tank. he looked at me and says, "That's probably not going to happen again, is it?" I said, "No, sir, it's not." He knew what happened, and he said, "Don't let it happen again." I said, "No, sir, I don't think it will." And it did not. And the Marines left my guys alone.
That's what I was going to say with the reaction. What was the reaction?
Yep. They
They
left
learned their
the
lesson.
guys alone.
They learned their lesson.
Yep.
Well, Lee, do you have any further questions? It's getting about time to wrap this up.
No, I don't think so. I've enjoyed this very much. I've learned so much. My time is in the ancient wars. Very personal. Very.
Sam, do you have anything further to add before we close out?
Well, not really. Do I have anything to add there, spousal unit?
The only thing I thought, because he was asking about the A10,
Uh-huh.
you could have mentioned it was called the Warthog, because sometimes people know that better than.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was called the Warthog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How big
And
a
also,
crew?
your nose art. You might, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Oh, the Desert Bell?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, after the war was over, after the fighting was over, they allowed us to put nose art on during the war, but after, So as soon as the shooting stopped, the crew chief come and said, "What do you want to put on your airplane?" Because I had my name on one side and the crew chief on the other, the canopy, and I said, "Well, I don't care," So he ended up putting this scantily clad lady laying underneath a palm tree on the beach, and it was called. He named it Desert Bell, Desert Bell. But you can Google that, and it will show up on the
It's
internet.
actually probably the most popular nose art that's out there.
Yeah, I took my son to get an A10 model once at Hobby Lobby or something, and went to the model section, and there it was, my plane with the nose art. It was a Revell model, and it
Desert
was
Bell.
Yeah, and so I bought it for him. But I think I still have one. I think. I just bought it.
This was all before political correctness set in January of 1993. We got political correctness
Yeah.
forced down on the military. But before that, we had two World War II veterans as presidents back to back, and things
Yeah.
were a lot different.
Well,
Even the nose art you guys had back in World War II was
The only A10 that had nose art was the Flying Tigers, and that was the same Flying Tigers back from China. Back in.
well, the
Chinon.
Memphis Belle was
Yeah.
one from
Yeah.
the B-17s, probably
Yeah.
the most famous B-17.
But that was the only A10 unit that was authorized to have nose art because it had the shark teeth or whatever, and so they had it, but everybody else didn't. So
Well, they were working for China. We had
Right.
nothing to do with them.
right, exactly.
They were privateers working
Yeah,
for China.
but as soon as a few months after the war, and we all got back to England, they made him take all the nose art off of it, But so I got to fly the A-10 back from Saudi Arabia. So we flew from Saudi Arabia to Sigonella, Sicily, and landed there. And then the next day up over Sardinia, over Paris, and then over London, and then to RAF Falconbury. But when I was in back then, France wouldn't let you fly over their country. They wouldn't fly military. When we went to Spain, we had to fly around France in peacetime to get to Spain. But they allowed us because we were allies during the Gulf War. They let us fly directly over France, like a one-time deal. But so I got to fly over Paris in an A-10, which hasn't been done that much. But yep.
John, did you have any nose art on any of your aircraft?
No.
None?
No, that's not a
It's not
that's
a
not a
Navy thing?
Navy tradition. No.
All right. Well, either of you, do you have anything else?
Well, I would have to say, my military time was awesome. It was one of the best decisions I did. When I left here in April of '87, when I come home in '91, I was a man. I was a boy, and then my family, as I'd come home on leave, they could see me transforming to a man, and it was one of the best decisions I made.
Lee, do you have any other questions?
I didn't make a decision. They drafted me.
guess we'll get ready and close this up. I want to thank our guest Sam Martin and our guest John Hughes. Also, we have Sam's wife Nancy is here in the room. You heard her talking earlier. As always, I want to be sure and thank our very able Joe Voris. Couldn't do that without him. He's really the nuts and bolts of this whole operation. Lee, as always, thank you for being here. And in closing, I'll say I'm Brad Bough, Lawrence County Veterans Service Officer and Vice President of the Lawrence County Historical Society. If you haven't visited our museum lately, I would certainly invite you to go over and visit our museum. Joe, thanks again. And remind everybody, if you love your freedom, be sure to thank a veteran. And thanks again, gentlemen.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Thank you.